Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and it's mostly a Scandinavian theme this week, although not exclusively. And today we have a Denmark-Canada crossover show as we share or present the remarkable story of two Danish soldiers who fought with Canadian forces from Normandy to Germany. Welcome to World War II TV, Niels. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Good evening. Thank you. I'm very well, very happy to be here.
So we were just talking before going live there about Denmark's story, because there's like lots of the countries that aren't in like the big list that you think of in terms of Normandy, UK, US, Canada. There was obviously the Danish story in terms of occupied Denmark, but then there's also this peripheral story of Danes who ended up serving here, there, and everywhere. There's Danes in the Navy, Danes in the Air Force, and Danes in the Army. And I think from what we were talking about, it's important to recognize that a country's contribution, there's the official sort of country's contribution, and there's individuals, as we had with Lassen last night. And so as a Dane, clearly you think we should be talking about Denmark's role more, even though it isn't perhaps what you wish it was. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, I think we've had to come to terms with it as Danes, but also as Danish historians, that we don't have this fantastic story to tell of Danish units that participated and things like that. But then we can tell the story of the individuals that fought individually, but also the stories of countries like Canada and the United Kingdom who let them fight and join in the fight against Nazism and for the liberation of Europe. And that's a great story that needs to be told too, I think.
Yeah, and it's exactly, an army can be made up of more than one nationality within an official regiment. So that's what we're going to be talking about, folks. So I'm going to power up the slides, and Niels in charge. So of course, folks, fire away with questions as you want to, because that's the way it works here. But I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this fantastic story. And the link, there'll be hopefully an English edition of the book next year. Is that right, Niels?
That's what we're working on. We have negotiations going on with a United Kingdom publisher, actually, and he's quite interested. And obviously, we have to get a few things in line with funding, translation, things like that. But it's in the works, and I have a pretty good feeling that by 26, there's going to be an English version of this book. And that's also because, and I hope you'll agree with me once we've been through the presentation. And I'd also like some comments on that, on the interest and angles to this. But I think it's a story that could be very interesting to many more people, it's not just a story of two Danes, it's also the battles they participated in. And also, I think it tells us something about the Canadian Army and how the Canadian Army fought. And that's an interesting story that needs to be told too, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So over to you then, sir.
Thank you. Well, I've got a slide deck here that I've made in English, and I think it mirrors what I usually do on presentations on the book, and it takes us through a few things. First of all, the Danish title of the book is Under Foreign Soil, Under Fremmed Muld. And that sounds like a bit of an odd title for a book like that, but that's really because it's from one of the diaries from one of the people, how he ends his diary when he's thinking about, and I'm going to reveal it here, he's thinking about all his lost friends during the war that are now resting under foreign soil. And we thought that was because the book is the story of these two people and on their diaries, we wanted to bring that ending of their diary up to be the actual title of the book that we were writing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about these diaries, who my co-author was, things like that. But that's the explanation for this slightly odd title. I don't know what's going to be in English, if there's going to be a different title, but that's the reason behind the title.
Okay. Thank you.
And you see the book cover here on the front page, Under Fremmed Muld in Danish. I don't know how many viewers are proficient in Danish, but then we can do a Danish lesson on another day. But it's really the story about two Danes. They were Niels Wiesneck and John Andreasen. And I think if I try to go to the next slide here, we can actually see who we're actually talking about in this book. And we have two good wartime photos of the two people we're talking about. It's Johannes, who was known as John Torvald Andreasen, born in 1910, who's one of the two people, and then the other one is Niels Madsen Wiesneck, born in 1920. And those are the two people we're going to be, the book is all about these two people, and those are the ones we're going to be focusing on in the presentation tonight. And you see that's their wartime photos from back then, actually, what they looked like back then. So, yeah, two pretty good guys that we've come to know quite well through these through writing this book. When I usually talk about the book, I often not just tell the story of these two people, because it's a really interesting story, but I like to tell how we came to do the story. I mean, how we who the authors behind it, that's one thing, but also how do we find the material? How do you actually find source material to write such a detailed story about two small individual soldiers fighting in a big war machine throughout Europe? And then I also usually talk a little bit about what was it like to write a book based on these diaries. I mean, how do you, as a historian, actually go about extorting material, stories, validating these diaries? How do you combine it with the military histories? You put it into a bigger context, so it's not just individual story. And then I also like to dwell a little bit on about how important the battles were they fought in, and what it was like actually writing the book. So that's some of the things that I hope we're going to be covering in the next hour or so. I think.
Brilliant.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. And let's crack on with it. Well, we're two authors here. We're myself there. I do the presentation. I get the biggest picture on this one, but I actually really have to mention my co-author, Jakob. And Jakob, he's also Danish, lives here in Jutland, just like me, in the western part of Denmark. Jakob is also a historian, and he's actually worked at the Utah Beach Museum down in Normandy. So we worked down there. You know it's a great museum there on Utah Beach, just on Arthur Janke's old Widerstandsnæs 5 there on Utah Beach. Jakob used to work there as a guide, and actually did some presentation. And he's actually one of the key people behind the new Danish memorial wall just behind Utah Beach at the monument for the Danish sailors. And I have a slide with that later on, so we can dwell on that. But it's really, we are the co-authors of the book, and we have equal shares in the book. But I really have to say that it was Jakob who found the source material that we're using in the book. And this slightly confusing slide sort of shows the combination, how we ended up with the book. Both Jakob and I were tour guides with a company called Kulturs in Denmark. We do military history travel, a lot of trips to Normandy. That's still the far most interesting place for everybody to go. But there are tours to Narvik in Norway, there's to Hawaii, to Japan, to England, to Market Garden, to all sorts of other different places. But we were tour guides there, military history tour guides, and we're both historians. And that's where we met up and combined at some conferences in Denmark. And Jakob wrote a book called Danes on D-Day. It's called something different in Danish, but it's actually just been published in English by Helion and Company. So it's available now, Danes on D-Day, and it sort of covers the story of all Danes that participated. There were airmen, as you said, there were sailors, there were infantrymen, there were all sorts of people. And during his work with this book, he found the diaries of these two Danes we're talking about, John and Niels. And Jakob contacted me and said, "Hey Niels, these two diaries, they're really special. We should write a book just based on these and sort of unfold their story further." And I think initially I was slightly reluctant. I'm also a military officer, and I sort of like to stay at the operational level and talk about the strategic thoughts and operational developments in Normandy, and not so much about the individual stories. I sometimes get confused reading Anthony Beevor's books when it sort of dives into the small individual histories and stuff like that. Not that they're not interesting, but it's sort of what you deal with. So I was perhaps a little reluctant to begin with. But then I got the diaries, and then I read them. And I have to admit, when I read these diaries, and I'm going to show you what they look like. And when I sat down and read these diaries that they'd written during the war, during their experiences, I was like, wow, this is a fantastic, not just a fantastic story, but also a fantastic source material. I mean, these people participated in battles that were hardly described anywhere else, or they added sort of new angles to it. In Operations Totalize and Tractable in early August, south of Caen, the Canadians, when they made some of their major attacks, they used their 40mm anti-aircraft guns during the night to shoot horizontally with tracer fire. And John Andreasen and his 40mm gun actually participated in this and describes what it was like shooting at night with a 40mm gun with tracer. And I was like, I've read about this operation. I've been to the terrain where it happened. And I've read so much about the tanks and what the problems were and all that stuff, but I've never seen a personal account of someone actually doing this. So there are personal accounts from battles also from the Scheldt Estuary and other places. So I was like, wow, this story really needs to be told. And through that way, we ended up in Under Foreign Soil in a Danish book, came out a couple of years ago. Actually got a fairly good reception, I'm happy to say, and I think it's a pretty decent book that I'm quite proud about, not just for me writing it, but also for conveying their story further. So that's sort of the route that it took to write the book. So that was a quite interesting process. And then we brought Jacob into the picture as well. Yeah. Talking about the source material, and I think that's actually really, really interesting, because that's both the historian's, primary tool. That's what we need to write this book. And for Niels Wiesneck, it looks like this. He wrote a diary throughout his wartime service. I'm going to come back to what exactly it was, but he landed on D-Day on June 7th, and then he fought all the way through till liberation in Europe to VE Day on May 8th in 45. And all through that, and also before that, the years before that, the Canadian service, the time they were preparing in England, all that, he kept a diary. And it's, you see some of it here just on the bottom of the screen, where it was a handwritten diary. They were all loose sheets. It's like it wasn't a book. They were all loose sheets, and you can see that he obtained paper from different sources, because it's all on different paper from different places, stationery from, then it's from a grocery store, then it's from somewhere else. Then he had these handwritten stories, and he was really careful with them and collected them. And sometime in Belgium, when they made it to Belgium in the autumn of 44, he got sort of a leather bind that he could put all these loose sheets into and then keep them in this leather bind. And he was a truck driver at the time in the supply section, and he kept this leather bind with this entire diary under the seat in his truck. And that's quite amazing, because he also tells some stories from Antwerp where trucks were, burned left and right and everything else. And it sort of raised the question to me, what if his truck had burned? What if his truck, he didn't even have to be killed, but if his truck had burned, the diary had burned, the diary wouldn't be here today. So it was a new experience for me as a historian to sit with material like this in my hands and saying, if he hadn't written that during the war, we wouldn't have had the material to write the story now.
Yeah, and just a quick question for you. I know you're going to come to more about their stories later on, but it strikes me that if you're a quote unquote foreigner within a unit, you might feel a bit isolated. You might feel a little bit lonely, a little bit different to everybody else. I wonder whether that lends itself to being the kind of person who would write a diary. If perhaps you're a little bit, you haven't bonded, if you're with people from the same area of Canada or the same area of Britain, for example, and they've all got a common background, and you're the foreigner there, whether that's a reason why you might put your thoughts down on paper.
That's a really good observation. I don't think we've actually thought about it through that angle, but that's an extremely plausible angle, and I can amplify it by saying that early in their diaries they write about their English not being very good. Niels hasn't been in Canada for a long time. He's a sailor that's caught outside Denmark, and then he ends up in Canadian service eventually. John, on the other hand, had been living in Canada for 12 years before World War II broke out. So he'd immigrated to Canada, so he spoke much better English. But they both write about in the diaries how communication was difficult, how Niels coming into an army, and obviously that's the personal angle. But then we're back to the Canadian Army actually accepting people into the army that weren't speaking very good English. I mean, today we'd say, no, we can't manage that. That's too difficult. We can't do that. But they actually did that during World War II, and he actually managed to fight on. But that's a good angle, the personal angle. We'll come back to the Niels is also he's very emotional also in the way he writes. There's a lot about missing his family, that he has to get thoughts out and stuff like that. So that's, as you see, I've written there many, many afterthoughts and notes. And you see a lot of times when he's written a diary, we can see that he went back at some point after and then added things to it. And then at some point after the war, he typed with a typewriter, maybe in the 50s or 60s or something like that. He's typed it into a document, sort of like a book. So he's been through a process. And those pages are equally interesting because of the afterthoughts. You see, he writes a story on the typewriter, and then there's all those handwritten things in both blue and red in between. And that's where all the emotions come out. That's where he sort of writes, this was terrible, people died, stuff like that. So that was a really interesting process, trying to sort of digest that as well. And there are hundreds of pages like this. Some of them are really difficult to read as well. I mean, I took a course in 16th century British handwriting at the university over there. That was pretty difficult, but this is, this is almost difficult to read at some point. What is he actually saying? And you can also see, because he's Danish, a lot of place names are written completely wrong. Like a Boforsgården is misspelled completely. But then when you sort of read it out loud, you say, oh, that's the location, that's the French town, that's the vehicle he's talking about. But that doesn't matter. So that's sort of the process of digesting through the material as a historian, I think. So and then you feel you get to know them a little bit when you read things like that over and over again. Niels also collected a lot of physical items. He was a collector. So he collected things, lots of things. And these are still in possession around at museums and private. Actually, the sack you see up there that says Canada on it was his his haversack, his military one that he carried with him. And you can see the place names of all the places he fought are written on it. And it's bloodstained. And that one is actually at the museum at Utah Beach today, at an exhibit down there. So there's a small exhibit in the Utah Beach Museum about Danes. So he collected stuff like that. The Nazi flag, of course, the golden ring he obtained from a concentration camp in northern Holland. That was also an interesting, did he steal a golden ring from a concentration camp? And he probably didn't. They were liberators of the concentration camp. And then as a historian, you have to think he probably traded it in for something or whatever they did. But, and he describes it himself. It's from a concentration camp in northern Holland in 45. There's the blanket there, and that has a special story to it too. That's his military issue blanket that they were sleeping in. And at first you think, okay, that's a blanket, that's nice. But when you read his diary, at some point in August, September 44, when they were fighting, they had a lot of casualties. And he describes in very much detail how Canadian soldiers are buried in their blankets. So all the soldiers call it the dead blanket, the death blanket. So that must have had a special meaning to him. Imagine him having that at home after the war. Every time he saw it, he would have thought about all the friends and soldiers that he buried in blankets like that. So suddenly things come a little bit more alive when you have both the items and you have the story to tell about it at that. So as you see, when I was reluctant at first, say, okay, personal story, can that bear a book? But seeing all of this, yes, it absolutely can.
Yeah, definitely.
For John Andreasen, it's almost the same, but then slightly different. For him, we obtained a finished manuscript that was 106 pages. And again, it's he kept a diary during the war, and then at some point afterwards, he wrote it in. He wrote it into this almost finished manuscript, also on a typewriter. So there's lots of little things you can see that are fixed, misspellings and stuff like that, typos and things. But it's 106 pages, and it's a continuous story that begins in Canada when the war breaks out, things like that. We only obtained it after John Andreasen was actually deceased. And there was an old friend of his that found it while clearing out the house. And we're again back to the truck burning. I mean, had this thing just been in a cardboard box from a deceased single man, just been thrown out to the trash, we wouldn't have had this source material to tell the story. So that's quite interesting. And there's only one copy of it. We've made another copy to work with, but there's only that one copy of it. So that was quite interesting. And it's clear that he's thought a lot more about the war while writing it. And you can see he knows some things with hindsight that he can write in afterwards.
Right. But
then as a historian, you can go in and see he doesn't glorify himself. It's a very neutral story that he's telling, really. So for all we can say as historians, it's a credible story. He doesn't glorify himself. He doesn't glorify the Germans or anything else like that. So it's a pretty credible story. And then we spend a lot of time cross-referencing it with war diaries and things like that to tell the story. So that's the source material that we had to work with, really. So just to cover that. So
thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the cross-checking, because that's the danger. I mean, I've got my great uncle's memoirs from the Normandy campaign, and 90% of it is is bang on, but there's the odd thing where he's got the date wrong, he's got the village wrong, he's got the name wrong. So you know you have to kind of learn to, okay, well he's mostly right, but in this case I think he just he misremembered it slightly, or he's been remembering his map slightly incorrectly. And sometimes I've looked at sources where you can think, I'm just going to dismiss this completely. There's just, it's too wrong. It's too many errors. I'm just, you know, I'm gonna discard it. I mean, I'm working on that stage of my next book, and there's a couple of accounts books, in fact, I bought, and I go, yeah, I'm not going to use any of this. It's just too all over the place.
Yes. And of course, he has dates and things that are wrong, but then again, you get, and now we're going to jump a little bit into the history, but at some point, that's with Niels Wiesneck, actually, he tells a story that he explains this up on the Channel Coast in the autumn of 44 in Ostende, and he doesn't say it's in Ostende. He says it's a bunker on the coast, and they're fighting very hard to clear it, and they finally clear the bunker, and out comes these Germans, and it's a German divisional headquarters, and they take all sorts of loot and booty and things like that, and he's very graphical describing it. When I look at the war diary, that his unit, the Essex Scottish, didn't do that at all. They weren't there. And I'm like, what's going on here? I mean, is this a story or what is it? And then finally I find, and it's not in the Essex Scottish war diary. I have to go look in other documents to find a bunker fight like that's been going on, and that's with a different regiment. But in that regiment's war diary, it says that they received a detachment from the Essex Scottish to help them out with clearing this bunker. I'm like, okay, now it fits. Now he was actually, but it just wasn't in the Essex Scottish war diary that they had detached someone to go with another regiment to clear this bunker in Ostende. And it was only because his diary was very precise, because they lost 2 men fighting for this bunker in Ostende, 2 Canadian soldiers. And he talked about them setting up a plaque at the end of the road leading to the bunker. And the memorial plaques for those 2 soldiers are still there today. So you could go back and find those 2 today and say that's what Niels Wiesneck wrote about, fighting for the bunker in Ostende. So you can sort of, how do you put it? The story was true. You know, I actually dismissed it and said, you know, this can't be true. You know, his unit wasn't there. How did he get there? But then finally, by doing this detective work, you could find out he was actually there. So that was quite an interesting process as well. And as you know, it took a lot of, you know, all the Canadian war diaries, they're PDF'd, so they're online. But looking through those thousands of old PDF pages on the screen is hard work as well. So but quite interesting work. So so great source material. That was the basic bit of it. Well, these 2 guys, I mean, how do they end up in Canadian service anyway? I mean, we just talk about as they just joined the Canadian Army, and that's worth a bit of a detour as well. Just however did they ever join the Canadian Army? And here are some photos from Niels Wiesneck. He had a camera with him, and that's another thing. Some of these photos actually. And this is from a training camp on the Canadian East Coast, where he actually went into the army first, where he went into training. So he's got lots of photographs from back then from Canada that he took photos, and that's really great. But Niels Wiesneck, he was a sailor. You know, you remember he was born in 1920, so he wasn't very old. He was about 20 about the outbreak of the war. He lived in Copenhagen in Denmark. His father was a painter, like a scene artist, and it's artist for the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. And Niels actually wanted to be an artist as well, a painter and artist as well. But his father didn't mean he had the psyche for it, that he was too fragile in his mind to be an artist. He actually recommended him to join the Navy. And that's not usually how we think of the Navy, as being, you know, psychologically friendlier than being an artist at a Royal Theatre, but you know, it might have been like that then. So he ends up joining the Merchant Navy and goes sailing. And I think maybe he's got maybe he was just a fresh kid. I mean, it looks like from his diary that the strict rules and the regulations and the normal everyday life, that was good for him on these ships, you know, that there was somebody to take care of him and things like that. So he was probably just a fresh young kid like that. But when Denmark was occupied by the Germans on April 9th, 1940, he was caught overseas. He was on a ship, the MS Europe, that was sailing overseas. So he wasn't able to get back to Denmark. So he had to do something else. And he sails with this merchant ship, MS Europe. He actually participated in sailing the Norwegian state gold out of Bergen to the United States. He sails across the Atlantic a few times. The ship's commandeered by the British. It's retrofitted with anti-aircraft guns, and then it's actually bombed and burns out in Liverpool, and then he has to join another ship. And he ends up in New York in 1941 when he then leaves the ships, and then he tries to join the American Army in 1941, but he can't because Denmark is not an allied nation. So he makes it to Canada, to a Canadian family where he spends some time, and then he joins the Canadian Army, which will let him join. And then he becomes a Canadian soldier, and then ends up being a supply driver, learns to drive a Bren carrier, drives trucks and stuff like that. So that's his way into the Canadian Army. John Johannes has a slightly different way. He was born on Bornholm, a Danish island out in the Baltic, in 1910. But when he's 17 years old in 1928, he immigrates to Canada to become a farmer. So he already lives in Canada and has been living there for 12 years when the war breaks out. It's out in Lucky Lake, out in the middle of the prairie in Canada. He has 2,000 acres of land, 50 heads of cattle. He has a good life there. But as he writes in his diary, and that's really how it begins, when Denmark was occupied, and he actually writes, maybe because it's because I'm from Bornholm, and this island has a special story in Denmark because it's shifted back between the Swedes and Danes, and they're full of fight in Bornholm. So he actually said, maybe it's because I'm from Bornholm, but I got really angry. And then he describes the situation in Canada, how they talk about the war, how all the men sort of talk each other up, they get more and more angry, they have to do something. And then he actually decides in 1941 to join the army, the Canadian Army, together with some other young men from his village there in Canada. And what really strikes me about these two stories, when you come to think of it afterwards, is none of these two had to join the army. None of them had to fight. I mean, they could have lived on in civilian lives. Canada didn't have conscription to go overseas at that time. John could have just kept on the prairie, kept his acres of land and his heads of cattle. Niels Wiesneck could have sailed or lived in America or something like that. No one had to join anything. They just volunteered. And that's quite I think maybe for the times we live in today, that's a little bit of a reminder that, some people will actually stand up and fight and actually join and do that because they weren't forced to it, neither of them. They just joined.
And I'm assuming, Niels, that the English language press, that's reporting the various things happening in Europe and Poland and France and Low Countries and Denmark. I'm assuming the English language press in Canada, the USA, Britain will be maybe perhaps less forgiving about Denmark's rather speedy capitulation in 1940, whereas perhaps some of the Danish press is kind of being a bit, well, the decks were stacked against us. We were looking at this, but if you're a Canadian, I'm imagining what they're hearing about Denmark is fairly, blunt.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a great point. That's a great story. Now, I just mentioned that Niels Wiesneck wasn't allowed to join the American Army. And he actually finds out, and I've never heard this before. I wrote in his diary in 1941 in the United States, in a boxing match. If you go down in the first round, if you really, really quickly knock out in the first round, the term used in the United States in 1949 was duck like a Dane, based on the quick Danish capitulation, which took 4 hours on April 9th, 1940. And it's not, I'm not saying it's nice to read as a Dane, but it's really interesting from a historian's perspective that capitulation could have that spillover. Actually, it has that political spillover effect that we're not allies and they're talking like that. It's really interesting. I never heard it before.
Well, we're still dealing with everybody's perception of 1940. I mean, one of the things living in France, and I'm going to kind of single out the Americans, but it's particularly American visitors who will say, well, of course, the French army surrendered in 1940. And you go, well, yes, but what about the 90,000 that were killed resisting? People remember the events of 1940 often in a very blinkered way, a very unnuanced way. Certain countries fought gallantly and certain countries capitulated very, very quickly. And of course, the actual details and truth is a little bit more complicated than that. But, we're still dealing with people's perceptions of that era, 85 years on.
Exactly. I often use it to reference to sports as well. When there's a tennis player that loses a match, everybody's like, why did he lose? And the quick answer is because the other side was better. And it's a little like that in war. You don't have to be bad. The other side just has to be better to win. And you can't, I think Winston Churchill said it, don't become so invested in your own plan, you forget to take into account the enemy. There are two sides to this, and one will win, and then sometimes you lose. And that's not to glorify the Danish effort in April 1940, which is a totally different story, not to be proud of, but such a realities. But it was really interesting to see that personal spillover on these people as well. you know. And I think they actually, in the Canadian Army, I think some of the Norwegians were allowed to join because they resisted the Nazi invasion. So they were allowed to join Air Force and stuff like that, which Danes weren't allowed to at the time. That came later on, and that's great. But so yeah, really interesting angles to it.
Thank you. Back to you.
Absolutely. All right, let's so they both joined the Canadian Army there in 1941, and then they actually do a lot of training in Canada. They described that as well, and that was really interesting for me to go back and read Canadian Army history at the time, because the Canadian Army at the time weren't really very good. I mean, they didn't have much material. I mean, they had to train in bad boots with no machine guns, stuff like that. But they did basic military maneuvers, and that's sometimes how war starts as well. You know, they luckily they didn't have to go to war until several years later in Normandy, so they had time to get all the material from the United States, from England as well, primarily with guns and stuff like that. But they described this training going through Canada, and then eventually they're transferred to England, of course, to wait for the big push, and that's an interesting story as well. I think John Andreasen is sailing on the Empress of Japan from Canada on one of the convoys across the North Atlantic, and that's just showing, I think, me how far we're getting around. I mean, we're talking about two guys that participated in a little battle in Canada, but actually they were part of the convoy system in the North Atlantic. And he describes the voyage sailing on this Empress of Japan, and I had to go back and look up the ship. It's renamed because Japan wasn't a very nice name at the time, being at war with Japan and all that. But it was the Empress of Japan, and they were actually torpedoed in the North Atlantic. And he describes how they were all called top deck, and they didn't see the torpedoes, but a German U-boat fired torpedoes at them. And he describes how he from the deck could see warships, Canadian frigates or UK destroyers or whatever it was, he doesn't say, that were chasing around. They were chasing the submarine with depth charges. So he describes that scenery. And again, the story could have ended right there at the bottom of the North Atlantic on a troop ship. You know, some of the stuff that these people survived, this is one of them, you know. And me as an infantryman, I mean, imagine being torpedoed in the North Atlantic in the middle of the winter on a ship like that. That would have been horrible.
Yeah.
So too many were. So very many interesting small side stories and angles to it. But anyway, they make it to England, both of them. And I think what sort of sums up their period in England is training, and waiting. That's most of it. And that doesn't come as a surprise to anybody. I think that's well described anywhere else, but sort of that's also sort of goes to underpin their story. But there's lots of training going on. John Andreasen, actually, he wanted initially to be a pilot because he liked airplanes, but he couldn't be a pilot, so he wanted to be an anti-aircraft gunner. So he became an anti-aircraft gunner on a 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun, and apparently he's very good at it. I don't know why you're very good at it. If you're good at, you know, shooting clay pigeons or something like that, whatever kind of eyesight you need to have to be an anti-aircraft gunner like that. But apparently he's very good at it. And he's very good at aircraft recognition because they spend a lot of time on aircraft recognition as well in the United Kingdom, he explains. And he's very, very good at it. And that actually means that he comes into combat before Normandy, because he's sent down, and the photo you see here is not him, but it could have been him. But that's a Canadian 40mm Bofors gun on Brighton, down on the south beach of England. And he actually participates in his first action where they shoot down a Dornier 17 coming in at low altitude. So he's actually in combat before he actually lands in Normandy. And that's a pretty interesting story as well. Yeah. So, yeah. So, but otherwise, the story is mainly about waiting. They live in terrible bog camps. That's wet, dreary. You know, England. You've lived there once. It really tells the story of England like that. Soldiers fight. You know, they have soldiers that come back to barracks and are drunk, and then they have to beat them up and tie them down to the beds and stuff like that. And then they meet Montgomery, and that's significant enough for them to tell the story, to describe it in more detail, how they were all marched out to an access training area. You know. Stood up in ranks and everything, and then Montgomery came driving in a jeep, and then stands up in the middle, and nobody can hear him. And Montgomery, being Montgomery, he just, come here, listen to me. And then they all sort of break ranks and run around, and then form circles around him, and then he gives them a pep talk before Normandy. He doesn't say when this is, but it has to be early 44 before they land in Normandy after Montgomery came back.
And it's also always worth mentioning. We've got Norma in the sidebar from Canada. Is that as you said there, Canada had a long wait in Northwest Europe. I mean, some
Oh,
countries,
yes.
Australia, for example, part of the empire, they're at it in Iraq and North Africa and early in the war. And it's there's a higher decisions being made about which forces are going to be sent to which places. But some of the Canadians had been here 3 years. They've passed
Yes.
in England just or elsewhere in the
Yes.
UK,
Yes.
just waiting to do something. And as you say, training. But it must have instilled a bit of a frustration that there are other people in other parts of the world, fighting back the Nazis. We talked about Andreasen yesterday, who just wants to kill Germans. So he's at it in, East Africa and Greece and stuff well before these guys get a chance. But it's not their fault. It's just that's the system.
That's the system. That's the way of the war. And actually, Niels Wiesneck ends up joining the regiment, the Essex Scottish. And the Essex Scottish, precisely for the reasons you're describing, participated in the Dieppe raid in 1942, where they chose Canadians because then Canadians would have something to show, fighting, and then Dieppe raid ends up in a disaster, and it's not a very good story and all that. But he joins after Dieppe, so he was not at Dieppe, so he joins the unit afterwards. But they have people in the unit that had participated in the Dieppe raid who had nightmares about it and couldn't function anymore, had a PTSD-like symptoms from the Dieppe raid and things like that. So they're all sort of very eager to go to war and describe what it's like waiting and things like that. So that's very interesting as well. So that's some of the waiting time in England that's described as well.
Yeah.
But then obviously then D-Day comes along, because that's what it's all about in the fight in France. And we're going to go back to their actual landings, but they participated in the entire Canadian campaign. They were hardly on leave from June 6th. John Andreasen lands on June 6th in the afternoon on D-Day on Juno Beach, and Niels Wiesneck lands on June 7th on the afternoon. So from then on and then on till VE Day, and this is a Canadian map here that was in Wiesneck's possession that he had with him, and that's an official map that shows some of all the Canadian engagements along the way. And he also got a personal map where he drew in where he were along the way. But because the Canadian Army was together, they were fighting together, and these two, Niels and John, were in two different divisions. One was in the 2nd Canadian Division, the other one was in the 3rd Division. But they were never far apart, in the Canadian. They always had that left flank along the Channel, all the way up through, after Caen they did, all the way up through Calais, up to Antwerp and the Scheldt Estuary, and in Holland, and all those fights and all that. So they were fighting alongside each other more or less all the way. So that was their route up to Denmark in that sense. So they participated in all of it. They were hardly on leave during the period. Nobody went back to England or to Paris or anything like that. They were with their units for the entire time through that entire stretch from Normandy. Just to steep on their war duties, what they were doing. More specifically, John Andreasen became a gunner on a Bofors. He was in the 4th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, attached to this. He was in the 69th Battery of that regiment, and they were attached to the 3rd Canadian Division. And for most of the period, they were protecting the artillery brigade of that division. So he was mainly centered around the artillery brigade of the 3rd Canadian Division. And shortly before they land in Normandy, they were issued not with towed guns, but with this self-propelled, the Morris C-98 vehicle with the Bofors gun on the back, and they liked that very much. At first, they thought it was heavy, but they liked it very much. They had to dig it in very many times, all the way down to the top of the wheels. But digging's good; that keeps you safe. So he was a gunner. Later on in Holland, he was actually promoted to Lance Bombardier to be the commander of such a gun. But that was his duty all along the way on one of those Bofors guns. John Andreasen, he was a supply driver in the supply section of the Essex Scottish, and was driving such a Canadian military pattern truck through the entire period. So it was a truck similar to this that he was driving through the period. So that was their war duties all throughout. They landed in Normandy, as I said. They described that as well, what it was like landing, especially John Andreasen, because he landed on the afternoon of June 6th. He came into Juno Beach, and he describes, as all the other descriptions, he describes what it was like coming in, that the sea was full of landing craft. you know, of things exploding. He still talks about a lot of explosions on the beach from German artillery and things like that. And I'm not really sure where that came from, but that's what he's explaining. But it was quite an experience landing. You imagine he was on that vehicle that he had to get out of a landing craft somehow, and then get ashore and then get inland. And this is also where the story becomes really interesting, because after he lands with the anti-aircraft vehicle, they were quickly rushed to the front. And because of the confusion there, on June 6th, he actually rushes almost in front of the infantry lines because he was mobile. So he actually gets closer to Caen than some of the Canadian infantry, according to his own. And then they quickly have to pull back behind their own lines, and then they set up position in some woods just behind Juno Beach in Normandy. So that's his experience. So he's actually landing on D-Day and has that experience. And then it takes another few days before they actually get into combat. And I think if you'd allow me, I'll just read out. I know it's in Danish, but just to let these guys speak as well, sort of how he describes the first time that he actually shot down a fighter, and that's quite interesting. And this is in the woods on the 9th of June, just behind Juno Beach, where they were fighting. And there's just a quarter of a page here that he's writing, and I'll try and translate it into English as I'm writing. So that's the reason for some of the. And he says, 2 German fighters came at 1,000 meters altitude, and when the anti-aircraft guns opened up after them, one of them was hit and crashed burning to the ground. The other one nosed down to get away from the hail of anti-aircraft bullets that was sent after it, and during that, it almost shot continuously with its machine guns. At the same time, it was shot at from all the other guns from our troop. We weren't able to fire because some trees were in the way, but when it was approximately 20 meters in front of our gun and we could see the pilot in his seat, he probably figured out that he'd made it. When he was straight in front of our gun, we opened fire. At that point, he was no more than 10 meters above the ground and crossing right before our gun. I was in the right seat and minding the altitude. The other seat was minding the speed. When the fighter was in my sight, I yelled on, and at the same time the other man yelled on. And then the machine was straight in front of the gun. The corporal said fire, and everything happened at once. We sent 4 grenades after the fighter, and it only took a few seconds, then it was all over. The first grenade hit it straight in the cabin, and when it exploded, the pressure from the grenade threw the machine on the side, so one wing hit a road tree, and the machine crashed to the ground and exploded in a fiery crash just 10 meters from one of our guns. And that was his first sort of engagement with aircraft in Normandy. And there's lots of descriptions like this. And it's interesting that this was the first engagement, so he spent some time describing it. And then as he continues, obviously the Luftwaffe becomes fewer and fewer, but then he doesn't describe the individual engagements anymore. Then it was just like, today a lot of German aircraft came and we shot some of them down. So this was the first engagement, and that's, the personal process again of writing down the first one, and then it becomes more normal. So that's quite interesting. So, some story. And there's a lot of problems in Normandy. That German patrols infiltrating. One of the sergeants from one of the other guns are killed by a German sniper. There are booby traps everywhere, things like that. So it's pretty grim in Normandy, actually. And Niels Wiesneck, he has a much worse time in Normandy. And that's some of the really interesting part. Just before D-Day, just before the landings, Niels Wiesneck develops a bad tooth, an infection in the tooth. And because his regiment is isolated before D-Day, they can't communicate with anybody else, so they can't explain where they're landing and stuff like that. So he's taken away from his unit and can't rejoin them. So he's taken away to the dentist and has this tooth pulled out, things like that. And then, as far as I can make out, he makes it into some personnel reserve pool. And then he's sent as an individual replacement to Normandy on June 7th, because his regiment doesn't land until July 5th. Almost a month after D-Day, but he actually lands on June 7th. And his diary through that month until he rejoins his unit is very strange. The guy was a supply driver, but what he's describing actually looks like infantry from the front line. And that's quite interesting. He clearly describes some of the fighting that we know the Canadians did outside Caen, where the SS found them in the open wheat fields and stuff like that, and slaughtered them with mortars and machine guns and stuff like that. all his descriptions completely fit that, being in the middle of that. And I think maybe he's been a medic or something like that, or maybe he did something far worse that sort of marked him for the rest of the war. But there are some pretty grim descriptions. And just to keep on reading, I think I'll just do a little reading as well from some of the stuff that he experienced at the front line, because that's quite interesting. He writes, "The night had been strong at the front. Our vicar was already on his way up. 44 people had passed at the great river at the French wine fields. 44 homes lost a son, a brother, a father. 44. 44 blankets with a young man in each. 44 holes in the ground. 44 small white crosses. 44 letters the priest had to write to 44 parents who he knew so well from home. This was a tough day and a long day, even for a priest. Many more were missing that we didn't know the numbers of. We saluted over the grave and last call. Who could cry now? Or who would? We both would and we could, but we didn't, because otherwise we would have cried the entire way. It's all a coincidence, also, that you're living." So he's very marked by some of the fighting there around Caen, and I've taken a picture here of the little bouquet of dill, the flower that you use for eating herrings and stuff like that. That's dill, and he brought that with him home from a house in Caen. And he lived in a house in Caen that the Germans had booby-trapped, and they had poisoned some wine that they left over. One of his friends drank it and died from it. And he describes that for the rest of his life, he couldn't eat dill because it would immediately transport him back to Normandy, to around Caen, where dill was planted in this garden of this house where they were living. And yet he brought back with him this bouquet of flowers and of dill from Caen to remember the fighting around Caen. So that settled very, very strongly with him. So yeah, he participated in some pretty fierce fighting around Caen.
Did either of them mention that Canadians were murdered by the SS? I mean, the 44 men, we're assuming that's from actual combat, that's from shelling,
Yes.
that's from mortars and machine gun fire. But but both of them, no matter where you are in Normandy, the story of Canadians being murdered, everybody, they tried to kind of hush it up, but everybody found out about it. Did either of them mention that?
They don't mention it directly, but they clearly know about the story of the Germans, of the German enemy. That's absolutely worst around Caen. Absolutely. Right. And it's for both of them in Normandy. It takes on a completely different tone also with the German enemy when they come later in the war. But in Caen, it's absolutely worst.
Okay.
It's clear that the fighting in Caen is different from what they are fighting in different places. And I put in the picture of the night fighting. There weren't a lot of pictures of that operation during the night, but I found one night fighting photo from Imperial War Museum from back then. I also found one of the defrog priest, the personnel carriers that the Canadians were using south of Caen. A photo there, they described them, and that's really interesting to hear. One of them describing that these tanks came around without a turret, but they were carrying soldiers. We all know well they were the defrog priests that were used as armored personnel carriers by the Canadians. So there's lots of little details that are falling into place when you read the story, and then the story behind it. And that really caught on to me. I told you that I weren't too keen on some of the personal stories, but more on the operational level. But suddenly here was absolutely combined. You could actually see some of these personal stories that describe what you were visualizing, what you're reading in different books. So yeah.
And David O'Keefe is saying this all sounds like Verrières Ridge. He said it a couple of times aside by so he wrote about the Black Watch in that battle there, and he mentions that there was also Danes within the Black Watch. So Danes everywhere, so it seems, which is fantastic.
Yes, there was another Dane, Sven Mostgaard, who's killed at Verrières Ridge with the Black Watch and is buried somewhere down there. So, I mean, we don't know. Wiesneck could have been there, as an individual replacement. That then later went back to his unit, and that's why it's not described. But his own writings from that period are very, very tormented, and very, very graphical and visual about blood and people dying and everything like that. So it was a terrible time around Caen. and that we've almost covered this bit about sort of combining it with the history of war, with the war diaries, reading a lot about the Canadian war effort in general, and I think that's a war effort that's under-described as well. And I can understand why the Canadians are trying also to tell their part of the story more. So it's not just about the Americans and the British, not to take anything from their effort anyway, but just to show the full story of all the other nations that were fighting.
Yeah.
And they describe different battles. I mean, I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but Wiesneck tells a story about the fighting in the Forêt de la Londe along the Seine River when they're crossing. And they come up there in late August to the Forêt de la Londe, where the Germans are trying to fortify the Seine to get as many units back across the Seine on the strategic retreat there after the Falaise pocket. And he describes that fighting very graphical, and I was just like, I had never heard of it. But sort of a lot of my sort of interest in Normandy sort of finished with Normandy in the Falaise pocket, and was not so interested in the pursuit up till fighting resumes up in Belgium and southern Holland. But he describes that in very much detail, and I went back, and it was difficult to find accurate descriptions of it. But then I found some different Canadian papers that had written about the fighting in those forests, and I just sat with this material. And I thought, if the Canadian military historian who wrote the story about the fighting at the Forêt de la Londe around Boulogne south of there, if he had Niels Wiesneck's story, that would have been prominent in that telling of the story, what it was like drawing a supply truck with anti-tank shells up to some of the front anti-tank guns and stuff like that. So, and that made me think some of the material we have here has, international interest and international level in terms of what it's actually explaining about.
Well, it's particularly the truck driving aspect, because the race is on now. Post the second, after the Falaise Gap, it's all about speed. This is where the mechanized nature of the Canadian and British armies comes into play. The Great Swan and the push up there, the reliability of armored vehicles. So, interestingly, that because the Normandy campaign earlier got a bit bogged down, a truck driver's role is maybe a little bit less vital, but come September, October, I mean, they'd have been doing dozens and hundreds of miles a week.
Absolutely, and it even gets worse in Antwerp. I'll tell you about that, but particularly at that point, because he has to get up with supplies, and he's driving on a road under fire. And we're again back to, he's a truck driver. That's not a very dangerous position. He's not an infantryman but the truth is, in an infantry regiment in the front line, being a truck driver is probably more dangerous than being an infantryman in a foxhole, because he's not undercover. And he describes how the Germans are shooting. He's driving a truck along the bank of the Seine, on the west bank of the Seine. He's driving on the Canadian side, and he has to get up to the front units, and the road is under fire from the Germans from the other side. So he has to throw his truck into a ditch and into a cave, jump out of the truck, crawl into a cave in the side of the hills there, and then try to survive there for 2 days. And the truck could have burned with the diary in it. That's the whole story of it. So he's been so close to being killed so many times being a truck driver. You think that's a non-dangerous position, but it was extremely dangerous when you read some of the experiences like that. Absolutely. And they have some quite unique photos that they bring back with them as well. That's John Andreasen with the Nazi flag there. The big guy, you can see he's a big guy. And the other one is of Niels Wiesneck. That's actually the Falaise pocket. And that's one of the interesting points. That's a Canadian official Canadian Army photographer that took that photo of him, that he then brought back with him himself. But that made it possible. He writes in the diary that they were at a hill at a special hill point, and I couldn't find that hill on the map because it didn't have the right number. And then so I could go back and see, where were the Canadian Army photographers on these dates in August 1944, and where were the unit? And it's like, oh yes, he forgot a one in the just in the number, and that's when you say in English, if you say hill 161, then he says, oh, 61, no, it's 161. So that's one of the sort of little language barriers and things like that, where you find the mistakes in the diary, but you can find an explanation for it. So that's interesting to see some photos of what they're doing there as well. And then they move up along the Channel coast, and that also sort of, well, it mirrors what the fighting was really like. Now it's more fragmented. They have to go to the different ports. Actually, Niels Wiesneck is around. John Andreasen is around Boulogne, so he actually talks a little bit about Boulogne. Niels Wiesneck comes up around Calais, talks a little about the fighting in Calais. He participated in the victory parade in Dieppe after Dieppe is liberated. And obviously he weren't at Dieppe, as I explained, but he takes part in the victory parade that the Essex Scottish is allowed in Dieppe after they liberated. And it's fantastic. I mean, that's one of the things that gets me every time I do these trips. I mean, the worst one is probably the British cemetery in Arnhem in Oosterbeek, you know, where all the school children go and lay flowers for the soldiers. And in reality, those soldiers didn't bring anything but death and destruction to Oosterbeek. But the communities there just love that they try to liberate them. And it's the same with Dieppe, that they love the Canadians so much and honor them so much. In reality, the Dieppe raid didn't do much else than, you know, bring further destruction to Dieppe, but they still really love it. So that kind of gets me a little emotional every time. So Niels Wiesneck gets a 3-day pass in Dieppe just to celebrate the Dieppe thing there. So that's the Channel Coast up there. And then they go on to Antwerp, and that's a really interesting side story as well. Also, when you said about the Big Swan, and we know how things sort of solidify in early September, and Monty has his eyes focused on Market Garden and the bridges and going into Germany and finishing the war before Christmas and all that. And then we get the story of what happened in Antwerp, and that's was it Admiral Ramsey who was it said afterwards it was one of the big mistakes of the war not to open the Scheldt estuary into Antwerp to get the supplies in and all that. And the Essex Scottish with Niels Wiesneck, they actually come into Antwerp, and his unit stays in the dock area of Antwerp and fight the Germans there in early September, where the fighting solidifies. And that's bloody interesting to read about, because I never knew anything about this. So they sit in Antwerp, and in the city center, you see, they can go to the cinema, they can eat ice cream. He actually gets a girlfriend there, goes home to her family, stuff like that. He's a good-looking guy. Again, we're back to the Danish, because when he speaks Danish, some of the Dutch boys, so the Belgian boys, thinks that he's a German. But then he points to his Danish flag on the shoulder, and then they find out he's Danish. Okay, then he's all right. He's not a German. Then they can actually talk to him. But his unit is out there in the docks, and he has to supply them with the supply truck. And that's again where it comes in that it's pretty dangerous to be a truck driver, because his regiment is out in this dock area. We're doing house-to-house fighting with the Germans, which is pretty savage. The Germans attack at night and sneak into the buildings and stuff like that. But he has to drive the supply truck back and forth across a number of bridges. And the bridges are under German observation, and they can shoot at them with mortars and 88mm guns. And he describes several other trucks that have just been hit and are burned out, and he has to drive back full speed. And I think that's pretty grim. And I'll just write a few passages here really quickly for some of the stuff that he's doing on the truck there. Every afternoon and morning, we drove from the city with supplies to the guys out in the docks. On our road, we passed a bridge that led over one of the locks. The bridge that were about to get so much meaning. The bridge that meant life or death. The rattling that was so weird when you rolled over it. Out here in the docks, things happened that only we witnessed. And there's so much shooting going on. And he's also has to, in that truck, to drive back with some of the dead Canadians, some of the dead soldiers that they have to rush onto the truck. So sometimes he rushes out there with the truck, only has a few minutes to unload ammunition and then get dead and wounded back on the truck and then drive it back. And then when he comes back, he has to wash off the blood on the back of the truck from the wounded and the dead. And then he goes into the city and goes to the cinema and goes out with his girl. And it sounds great, but I think that's put some great personal pressure on him, I think. So the story of the bridges are really horrible, what he describes there.
And you said earlier about, you know, the excitement of discovering these diaries, but you must have been even more excited when you realized how good the writing was, because everybody watching, there's quite a few historians in the sidebar watching who have discovered a diary and it ends up just being dates and, you know, we moved to this camp, we moved to that camp, we moved to this camp, we moved to that camp. Never a sense of what they were feeling, never anything written. But that last bit you were writing about, you know, even the fact they're mentioning death. I mean, that you don't get that very often. That particularly kind of the Commonwealth troops, the British Canadians, they tend to be very mundane, very just, yeah, we came through there, and but they're expressing themselves, which is really fantastic.
Yeah. And I wonder if we go back to that part about Niels Wiesneck, that his father said he didn't have the psyche to become an artist at the theater in Copenhagen, as you join the Navy, and then he's suddenly in this. And there's also a religious tone to it. And I don't think he's religious beforehand. I think it's the stuff about there's no atheist in the foxhole. I think it's the part that you're facing life and death every day. And think about it, at this point in September, well, they've only been fighting in June, July, August, September. That's only 4 months, but they're going to continue on for almost a year at the front line without any proper leave. I mean, no wonder they were under pressure here. So those are the bridges, and we don't have time to read some of the good passages. You'll have to wait for the book and stuff like that. But it's really horrible. I mean, some of the stories he's telling there from that bridge fighting, that was a really interesting period. But obviously they go on to the Scheldt usury afterwards, which we also know. And I mean, that's so forgotten. What was the movie that came out a couple of years ago that was also called The Forgotten Battle or something like that, because it was a forgotten battle. But they participate in that as well. And John Andreasen, he actually participates in the fighting around the Breskens pocket on the south side. And he explains how he puts this 40mm Bofors gun on an amphibious vehicle, drags it out of an amphibious vehicle and onto the dikes there on the Breskens pocket, and how he shoots at buildings and haystacks full of Germans with tracer ammunition with the 40mm and things like that. And that wasn't really described in some of the other stuff I was reading either. And Niels Wiesneck, it's really difficult driving trucks out to, he's out on Valkon and participating in some of the Canadian fighting out there on the islands there on the north side of the Estuary. And there's simply a story there, and I can't retell it here, and I don't do it in my lectures in the book either, because I'll start crying. And it's about a Norwegian fellow that gets killed by the Germans, and it's such a horrible story that I start crying every time. I've read it so many times I can't read it again, but that explains really how horrible it was, and it really shows from the documents, as you said, they're not too keen to talk about how horrible that fighting really was in the mud. Everybody's focused on the waiting for the Ardennes offensive, after Market Garden, things like that. This forgotten campaign in Scheldt is really well described here.
Yeah.
So terrible story. And then they move on, and obviously there's lots of stories to this, but then they also talk about the terrible winter. Then they get this winter pause from late October up till the big push in February 1945, and then they move up towards Nijmegen, and they're in the forest there outside Nijmegen in the Groesbeck forests, where the 82nd landed in Market Garden, and they take over their positions out there, and then they're stationary there for a few months over the winter. And that's good. That's good to get a pause. That's a good thing. But they experience wild things as well. I mean, at one point they go on a trip in the woods, and that must be around Duvelsberg, outside Nijmegen on the Groesbeck Heights, going close to the Reichswald near Germany. And they find an abandoned glider aircraft, obviously from Market Garden, that's still full of American troops. They're sitting in their dead, in their uniforms, in the glider that they're seeing. And he describes quite accurately what the glider looks like, what's drawn on the sides of it with chalk and things like that. So there are some really funny side stories to that. But otherwise, it's a couple of months of waiting during the terrible winter there. And it's obvious through diaries, Christmas is a special time. They're all thinking about their loved ones at home. You can see Wiesneck's Christmas drawing, which actually I think I have an enlargement of it here in the photo. I don't know if you can see that better. But he writes the bang. There's a Christmas tree. There's Father Christmas. There are grenades coming for Christmas. And then he sort of ends up with finishing. I wonder what's going to happen in 1945. So there's a lot of thoughts going on around Christmas for a guy like that in the trenches.
And I wonder what information they're getting about Denmark. I mean, because obviously the Canadian newspapers wouldn't be reporting much about Denmark for two individual Canadian Danish soldiers. So there'd be a certain amount of things about RAF raids, I suppose, like that on the BBC, but they wouldn't be getting letters from relatives or anything. So I'm assuming they really don't know much at all.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're mostly just writing about, missing their families at home. I wonder what they're doing now. Are they doing Christmas like we used to do it? Things like that. So there's a lot of emotion coming out there. There really is. So that's quite interesting. But then there's their everyday life. There's a German shelling to them. They're shelling back. they describe Wiesneck at the time actually draws in his diary. He draws a V1 bomb. You know, that they don't know what it looks like at the time. They've probably seen drawings by now of the V1. But then he explains how it comes over at night, and he sort of sees the boop, 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 engine and how they come over, and he actually has a little drawing of a V1 in his diary. It's quite interesting, you know, what they experienced at the time. So yeah. So and I think at that time, at some point along that way, they see their first jet aircraft as well. You know, imagine an anti-aircraft gun explaining the first time that it sees an aircraft without a propeller, and it comes really fast, and it sounds weird, and it comes out of the sky, and what is that thing? And then they start shooting at it and things like that. So that's an interesting side story as well.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then comes the big push. Then comes Operation Veritable, where they push on in February and then attack down towards the Rhine, and that's a really big operation that they describe. Actually, Andreasen with his anti-aircraft gun, he's at the front of it. Some of these flooded areas that the Germans flood. So he's actually marooned with his anti-aircraft gun on a hilltop for several days, where they have to ferry out mail and food and different things to him in one of these things that's flooded there. So that's quite interesting. On the other hand, for Niels Wiesneck as supply driver in the Essex Scottish is in a really fierce encounter with the German 116th Panzer Divisions on the 19th of February, just around the Reichswald, where a Major Tilston is awarded the Victoria Cross for his engagement. And that's a really fierce engagement where the German Panzer Division basically runs over the headquarters of the unit. They have to hide in a basement. You know, they're almost routed by the Germans, but then beaten back. But Niels Wiesneck, he's not there, but as a supply driver, he has to go up afterwards and take out all the dead and wounded and describe what it was like that almost the entire regiment was wiped out. So that's, again, a different perspective on looking at fights like that. But he participated in that and were there. So that's quite interesting to follow as well. So lots of details to this period about what they're doing. Something I didn't know about was a pepper pot. As an anti-aircraft gunner, when there's no German aircraft to shoot at, then you shoot a ground target. It's a pretty good use of anti-aircraft guns, but it's actually technically called a pepper pot. So they actually take all the anti-aircraft guns, and they do this before the Rhine crossing in March. They sort of draw up their guns in concealment and then conceal them, get ready to shoot across the Rhine to support the Rhine crossing. And they hide in buildings and look at the Germans, look at targets, then they go down and then they fire until the gun gets red hot and malfunctions. You know, and then they just keep on firing at the Germans at the other side. So there's some pretty detailed descriptions on some of these engagements that sort of give you not just a personal story, but also sort of a bit of a very tactical level of how did they actually do these things.
I was going to ask you that about whether or not, as a light anti-aircraft, they adopt other roles, because that is one of the things about the 44, 45 is the Allies just get very good at putting as much firepower onto targets as possible, be it from machine guns, anti-aircraft guns. You know, if you've got barrels, point them in the direction of the enemy. And, you know, you see that in units evolving a role that isn't their primary role, but, you know, they've still got guns, they've still got shells, just find a different use.
Absolutely. They do at some point at a bunker in the Breskens pocket, where there's a bunker that refuses to surrender, and then they bring up the Bofors gun and puts 3 40mm rounds through the door, and then all the Germans come out and surrender. You know, better than storming with bayonets and grenades.
That would do the trick. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so that's interesting. He explains that, but especially here, I mean, but they still shoot at aircraft. I mean, on the I think on the 11th of February, there's a pretty big German aircraft attack on their position, and they actually shoot just from his battery, from the 69th battery. They shoot 1,600 grenades at jet aircraft just during the afternoon, and I can go back and read that in the war diary of the unit as well, of the 69th battery, how much they were actually firing. So it's completely accurate what he writes there. And those were mostly jet aircraft, and he describes this aircraft technique. I'm not sure it's an Me-262. It might be an Arado R at the time, you know, the 234 that was probably more common at that time to do bombings, but they're cutting off their engines and coming in high, and then they're coming out of the clouds so they can't hear them, and that's the problem. But then when they come close, they say the Germans are very good at putting on their engines and then getting out of the anti-aircraft screen before they actually get hit by it. So they say they're not getting very close and they're not hitting very much, but they're still getting some German air attacks that they're defending against. So yeah, there's some pretty interesting, you call it tactical observations that you could exploit from the diaries if you want to put it like that. So that's quite interesting as well. Yeah. pushing on, they participate, going over the Rhine, going into Holland. Then things become a little easier most of the time. There's still Germans around. They're still ambushed by little German diehard pockets, things like that. In general, things are easier when they come up to Groningen in North Holland, up through Ems. I think John Andreasen has his last fight on the 28th of April. That's the last time he's engaged shooting across a river on ground targets. And Niels Wiesneck is actually far into Germany in Oldenburg on the 3rd of May, when they start hearing about liberation. That then comes on 5th May for Denmark and Holland and northern Germany, and then the war kind of ends for them there. And that's really interesting reading about the war ending as well, because as we talked about, they've been in combat for almost a year at this point, continuously, and you'd think they'd be happy that the war ended. And they're just tired. They're just like, okay, great. That's fantastic. They're more relieved than they're happy. I think that the war is over, in that sense.
And it's also, we mentioned at the beginning, it's also a very different perspective for any soldier who is from Europe, because if you're from the USA or the UK or Canada, and okay, I know, he's living in Canada for 15 years before the war, but you still, at times of war, you feel that kinship and that connection with your original country. So, yes. They'd have been worried about families, distant families, friends they've left behind in the Netherlands. Whereas if you're a Canadian from Toronto and all your family are in Toronto and all your wider family all around Toronto, at least you're not worried about them. But if you're in the French 2nd Armour Division, or you're in the Danish or the Norwegian number 10 Commando, yes, as much as you're facing the prospect of the war coming to an end, there's also the realization of what's going to be left of my country. What's going to be, what am I going to find out about my relatives?
Yes. And I think they're quartered with German families, and they're told not to give them anything. These are the Germans, these are the enemy. But you come in and live with a family, and you can't be an enemy with a family, and then the war is over. And I think John Andreasen speaks some German, so he can speak with some of the Germans that he's living with, the family. And the father finds out that he's Danish and that he speaks German. He asks him, my son, he's in Air Force, he was a Luftwaffe pilot, and he's in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. Do you think he's all right? And he could clearly tell him, yes, if he's a prisoner of war camp in Canada, he's absolutely fine. You should be very happy that your son is in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. And the father's very relieved to hear this, that way around. And they actually sort of go as far as writing, and they're not excusing the Germans, but living with a German family in North Germany, they say there's a lot these people don't know about what actually happened.
Yeah.
So suddenly they get a face to the enemy. It's not enemy soldiers, it's enemy family, and they get a face to it. And that's probably not weird to imagine. So, yeah. And just to I only thought about afterwards, writing this, when you write this and you see how these people have ups and downs. And I actually included this in lectures, and it's not in the book actually, what I call the soldier's sinus curve. And I thought that was quite interesting, sort of following their personal story and development throughout this whole thing. And as you see, the middle axis is going, slowly downwards. But there's ups and downs. There's an up in traveling outside. Then there's Denmark occupied. They get depressed. They get down. Joining the army, we're doing something again. We get up again. Boredom in England, down again. D-Day into battle, we're doing something. We're shooting down Germans. Up again. The Verrières Ridge, the fighting in Caen, that really got them down. And you can read, you can see those feelings showing in the diaries, how they're up and down throughout the whole thing. And it still goes up and down, but the major trend is down. I think when you read through it, it's going slowly down, and I think that's the pressure on a soldier in combat.
Pressure, fatigue, yes. I'm glad when you sent me the PDF, and I saw that chart there. I was really pleased that you had expressed it that way, because often I've thought about that, and I've spoken to other guests about, because what happens in wartime, I never lived through a war, folks, but all emotions are heightened, aren't they? When you're down, you're really down. But conversely, when you're up, you're really up, because it's the extremes. Everything is extremes, and it's the changes. You could be literally burying one of your friends on a Monday, and Tuesday you're meeting people in a town that's been liberated and receiving bouquets of flowers and kisses. And it's like, it's the constant up and down. So I'm really impressed that you sort of marked that journey, and particularly that it's a downward trajectory, because you would think that as the war's coming towards an end, the overall feeling is going to be one of improvement. But as you say, they've been at it for so long, and been beaten down by it all.
Yeah, they have, and that goes to they continue their diaries a little bit after, and we know what happened to them after the war as well. What happened to them, both from friends, family. There were also some interviews and things like that. So we sort of know what happened after the war to them, and that's an interesting veteran story that's often not told. And I'm a veteran from Afghanistan and stuff like that, not too, but I've worked a lot with veterans and seen those things, and just reading this. Those things weren't in place back then. And of course you couldn't do it because you had millions of people fighting. They couldn't all be, they just had to go back and continue their lives and stuff like that. There weren't time for having PTSD and being down and stuff like that. That's what the world was like at the time. That's what it was like. But you can clearly see it, especially in Niels Wiesneck with that psyche that he had. He went on to become a teacher at a maritime school up in Frederikshavn in Denmark. But then after some years, his psyche couldn't really take it, so he just went to a normal school. But he got a wife and 4 kids. I think he was a great father, but his kids also describes that sometimes the father just he couldn't, there was too much noise, he had to go down to the basement and just have some quiet time. And that's just, it screams PTSD, doesn't it? I mean, today, but it wasn't back then. You have to go to the basement. That's what men did back then. So and I was actually, that's another twist, and it's really, we had this material, and he had 4 kids, and it was Jacob who had the contact with them. I didn't really know them. And then I went out to give a lecture on the book up in Northern Jutland. And then, before I start the lecture, then this guy comes up to me and said, "Hey, Niels, do you know, that's Wiesneck's son sitting over there?" I'm like, okay, I'm going to be telling the story of his father to his son in this lecture theater. What's that's going to be like? I'm going to say something bad or wrong, and he just came up afterwards and he said, "I never knew what my father did. Now I do." And that's just, that's a really, if that doesn't get to you, I don't know what. I mean, that was just, so that's, and how could you tell that? That's the other thing, you hear about veterans. And I think that impressed me most at the D-Day Museum in England down in Portsmouth. When you enter it, on one of those, there's a veterans area down there as well. And there's one of these D-Day veterans who says that it wasn't until he joined a club that talked about D-Day with other veterans that he could explain his experience. I mean, as Wiesneck, how would you explain driving a truck through the bridges of Antwerp, getting shot at with dead people in the back, to your sons back in Denmark 20 years after the war? I mean, that wouldn't make sense. I mean, you couldn't convey that seriousness of that situation. So that's a really interesting angle to it. So, and Paul Andreasen, he went to Bornholm, died a single man, no kids. So yeah, that's the story of those two. And I just really want us to remember them. I mean, as you see, John Andreasen, he went back to Normandy on invitation. I think that's in 1984 for the anniversary there. But Wiesneck, he said he could never go back to those places. He didn't want to go back. Right. He couldn't take it. So,
and you may have said this, I may just not have been listening probably. Did John go and live in Canada again and go back to farming, or did he eventually go back to Denmark?
He actually went back to Canada for a little while, for a few years. He actually stayed in the army for a little bit. Then he was discharged. Then he actually went back living in Canada for a little while. But then he went back to Denmark and lived on the island of Bornholm and went back there and had a quiet life back there. So yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah. And then I think just for the end, there's the memorial wall you mentioned. Now they have their own plaques at the memorial wall. Jacob played a great part in getting that wall approved and built and things like that, just behind Utah Beach. You see me as a tour guide there with a group that we're visiting as well. So obviously invite people to visit that at some point and look at some of the Danes and what they did. It's just one thing. Often what it was like writing the book. I think we covered that very much. And then just for the end, I think you can still meet Niels and John at museums. And that's a photo there of Niels Wiesneck's sack lying at the museum down in Normandy, the Utah Beach Museum. So if you go there, make sure it's a little bit tucked away in a corner, and that's quite all right because the Danish participation wasn't that big. But there is a little mantra there that has some of the things and tells the story and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the story of the book and of Niels Wiesneck and John Andreasen, really. So
well, a brilliant presentation. And for the Danes who are watching, obviously they can buy a Danish version of the book. The rest of us who are English speaking will have to wait a little bit later, but I will keep. I guess you'll keep in touch with me, Niels, and when it is available in English, I'll amend the details, the description, so people can find it. And we had a couple of questions for you right early on, Niels, and one was from Gary saying, "Do you have because of Denmark being a seafaring nation, there were ships around the world when the war broke out. There were Danes, as you talked about, living in Canada. There were probably Danes living in the UK, Australia. Do we have any know what percentage of Denmark's population were to actively serve in some shape or form? Because, as we said, it's not just the population of Denmark per se, it's the Danes around the world.
Yeah, I think there were around 800 Danish sailors just on D-Day that participated. And I think there were 34 ships at the time that were actually under Danish flag. Percentage-wise, it's probably not very much, but it's a sizable contribution. It's one of the larger contributions from a small nation like that.
Yeah.
So I think we can be proud of that, and we can be proud that nobody really, joined the Nazis in the same way. Obviously, some joined for the Eastern Front and things like that, but nothing comparable to who actually wanted to fight, both against Nazism and for the liberation of Denmark, really. So 800 sailors just on D-Day, 34 ships under Danish flag, and then we also had some notable people, like Andreasen, who's famous, and that's quite all right. But there's also people like Niels Wiesneck, John Andreasen. There was another Dane who was actually parachuted into Normandy with the 82nd Airborne on D-Day, Danish fighter pilots, things like that. So they were all over in different places. Yeah.
And Niels Bohr came up in the conversation. Without him and some of his work, the Manhattan Project and things like that, there was Danish science, there was Denmark's rescue of its Jews, which are covering on Friday. So it's not a competition, folks, isn't it? We're not looking at countries and saying this country did more than this country. It's not about that. It's about those that did stand together, stood together against Nazi oppression, and it's a fantastic story. So, but my last question for you, because you said at the beginning, something you said at the beginning resonated with me. You said that you were, an infantryman yourself. You like the operational level. You like that aspect of it. What has doing this book changed your perception of operational history? Because I'll give you my answer first, and then I'll let you speak. It's all very well explaining, here's the phase line, here's where they were supposed to be. It was supposed to go to this village, leapfrog through there, get to this river there, get to that hill there. You've got to have that context of what the hell everything was all about. Otherwise, it is just men running around and shooting each other. But without the color of individual participation, it is just movements on maps, isn't it? So has it changed you as a historian?
Yes, it has, absolutely. And I think it changed me in different ways. I think the one is the tactical one, where you actually see you see how the anti-aircraft gun is used, you see their role in it, you see the truck driver we've been talked about so many times, what that actually looks like going into things like that. You said, why didn't they supply that unit in that village there on that face line on that map? Well, those were the truck drivers that were shot at by mortars and anti-aircraft guns. So it has changed me in that way. And maybe it also has because of the nature of the fighting, some of these places, like in Normandy, where it was extremely tight, in places like that. It wasn't major phase like on the Russian steppes or in the invasion of France and stuff like that. So it has changed me in that way to those places. And then looking at some of the places when you go, last time I drove south of Caen, and I was like, well, that's a stone quarry. That's where they were bombed by, I wonder if their truck were there or there. So when you personalize it, it certainly gives something to it.
Yeah, and then as you said, sorry. Dude.
Oh, I think that the really big thing to it, I think what I really thought about afterwards is these two people didn't have to join. I mean, they might as well couldn't have. And I think that really gets to me. And it's pretty clear from what they're writing. They did it both to fight for the liberation of Denmark, but also against Nazism. They knew Nazism was bad, was an evil to be fought. There's no doubt about it when they're sitting in Canada and thinking, I have to join this fight and do something about it. And the Canadians let them join. And obviously other nations also let other nationalities join and stuff like that. But if people like that didn't commit themselves and join, what could have happened? It's
very good point.
Level. Yeah. So that really gets to me as well, I think, in sense of war.
And I think the other thing you said about the truck driving aspect, because thinking about how I host the shows on this channel, when it comes to trucks, it then brings it into the logistics. So when we're talking about logistics, we tend to talk about statistics. We tend to talk about it being X number of tons of this was transported by X number of trucks along this road, and they had certain number of bridges. And we need to understand it in that terms. I'm thinking of the show I did a couple of weeks ago about Lend-Lease aircraft, the Soviet Union. But at the same time, we do need that reminder that there's a bloke driving that truck, and then there's another bloke in the truck behind that truck. And it's, sometimes we need to understand logistics from that volume point of view to understand just how many beans, bullets, and bandages were shipped. But with infantry, we do talk about the military cross recipients throwing grenades over hedges and knocking out machine gun nests. But trucks, we tend to talk about it as units. So again, thank you very much for reminding us that truck drivers, electrical and mechanical engineers, all those guys, it was individuals as well who are also terrified, just like the infantrymen.
Absolutely. And there's some great, when you get the book, and there's some great stories from Antwerp, when he leaves Antwerp, when they have to go up to Holland, they drive at night with no lights on, because of security reasons and stuff like that. And he falls asleep at the wheel and then drives into a ditch, and ditches in Holland are really deep, so he can't get out. So they have to leave him. He's alone. They get the truck out, get it onto a field, feel a little unsecure. They turn on the lights. It's mine. And he still has one of those little flags, with the skull,
the yellow ones with the skull and crossbones.
Yeah. I mean, he could have been blown up right there. There's lots of stories like that where the truck driver actually went through, and that's you're right. That's a fantastic story, and addendum to understanding the completeness of war. That it's not just about the infantry, but what all those little wheels in the big machine that needs to go together.
Well, that's how the Allies won. It's the big war behind the shaft of the spear was big behind that point of the spear. Well, I feel we could chat all day about this, but we'll bring you back in the future and talk about something else. But in the meantime, it's been a fantastic presentation, folks. We're talking about Operation Freshman tomorrow, so have your kind of tissues ready, because it's a very sad story what happened to the Royal Engineers in their gliders going into Norway. So we're back into Norway tomorrow. But with that British Royal Engineer connection, I'm looking forward to that one. Bruce is the expert on what happened to the Royal Engineers as part of Freshman. Then we've got a story about Tirpitz and midget submarines on Thursday, and then Friday we are back to Denmark again and talking about the rescue of the Jewish population. So we're in Scandinavia for the rest of this week. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books. Visit their website. Read their blogs. Read their Substacks, and keep supporting what they do so they create us more content. That's why I say it. So in the meantime, have a very good rest of your day. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.